Bill, and then without further ado, let's jump into the first panel. If the panelists could come up. Our first panel is on globalism, global extension, and contraction, what lawyers need to know to protect their company's interest in politically uncertain times. And to make it a more interesting panel, we arranged to have the British election last week, and that only adds to the intrigue. For this panel, we're very fortunate to have as moderator Moselle Thompson. Moselle is a former commissioner of the Federal Trade Commission. He's the CEO of Thompson Strategic Consulting, where he provides innovative legal policy and business advice to companies such as Facebook, Samsung, Disney, Path, Loyal3, and others. And he has extensive experience, among other things, opening up foreign markets to American internet companies. He is an ideal person to lead this panel. We've got terrific panelists, and I'm going to turn it over to Moselle to introduce the panel and get started. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. You know, I have to tell you before we start that I never signed up for these early morning classes when I was in law school. So you're going to have to bear with me a little. Okay. So it's good to see everyone here. We have a really great panel here with some very interesting people with different perspectives, and I've learned a lot just from talking to them on the phone, and I hope that you will too. That as you heard this morning, this conference takes place during a time of great uncertainty, politically, substantively, all around the world. And it seems just that when we think we have a handle on what's going to happen in government, we get news that they were just kidding. That there's a change in the electorate, or that there are new policy pronouncements, or the courts have a different opinion. At the same time, the market seems to be on its own path for some reason. So it's not surprising that your clients are asking you, what's going on? So I think what we wanted to do here today is have a more casual discussion about what we're seeing out there and our thought processes on a variety of issues. So today we have Viola Benziger, who's a partner in the global law firm of Greenberg Traurig, and she chairs their technology practice in Germany. She advises international internet technology, fintech, and healthcare companies in the areas of e-commerce, digital products, and a whole bunch of other stuff. And she's licensed to practice in Germany, England, and Wales. And for all of these people, they're very distinguished, and there's a lot more you can see about them in your program. And to her right is Mark Owen, who's a partner at Taylor Wessing in London. Well, they're both the same, aren't they? They're just east of here. No. He's a leading IP and information litigator and transactional lawyer with over 25 years in practice. As well as being an English solicitor, he has been a member of the California Bar since 1993. Good basis for taxation.
Keep my options open.
Okay. To his right is Tony Falzone, who's the Deputy General Counsel at Pinterest, and prior to joining Pinterest, Tony co-founded CIS's Fair Use Project, where he led as its executive director from 2006 to 2012, and in the course of his work, Tony represented clients in many high-profile cases involving the rights of artists and intellectual property, and as a lecturer in law, he's taught here at Stanford. And prior to his work here, he was a litigation partner at Bingham McCutcheon. And then there's Todd Cohen, who is general counsel at StubHub, and he also serves as vice president and deputy general counsel of global government relations for eBay. Since 2000, well, Todd has done everything. He's done it all, and it's such a big list. And I'm happy that all of you are here to talk this morning. And I thought the first thing maybe we can start with is just at 10,000 feet, we're seeing all these things happening, you know, especially recent elections in the US and UK and even France, and different pronouncements of the paths that their countries want to go into. And each of you are involved with companies that are cross-border companies. And I was wondering, what are your clients asking you? And Todd, maybe you can start by, how are you advising your business units to respond to these changes? Is there a general approach that you're taking?
Good morning. Thanks, Moselle. It's great to be here. Counseling right now for the clients globally is obviously a challenge, and one in which each of us have to be able to sit down and say, like, what are the goals that that the different jurisdictions that we do business in, how important are those goals, and how willing are they to actually try to enforce different modes of regulation upon different parts of our businesses. So for StubHub, obviously, it shouldn't be the most important thing in the world, people going to events. It's fun, it's nice, it matters. It also generates an enormous amount of emotion around public policy. I mean, there's a reason why ticket resellers are called scalpers, and that you cannot believe the number of stories that get generated on a daily basis about people who want to attend events and think that prices are too high and that all the tickets were taken by bots and everything else. And it never ends, but for jurisdictionally and how you think about it within the clients, it's really a measurement of what is the law, where are they trying to apply the law, and whether they're going to enforce it. So it's a never-ending scale of laws that are on the books or laws being proposed, with the reality that in most instances, very little enforcement occurs. So you're always measuring that. So I'll give one example. Last week, a regional court in St. Petersburg in Russia ordered criminal proceedings against our company so that because of the sale of Confederations Cup international football matches that will occur later this summer. That was a pretty easy one to say, we'll take down those tickets. There's not a lot of debate over that. If you want to do business in St. Petersburg, you're going to listen to the local court that says that. But at the same time, there's a law, for example, and we'll just make one up, in Kuwait, where they also prohibit, or in Qatar, where they prohibit the resale of tickets for the 2022 World Cup, which obviously hasn't yet occurred, nor have tickets been sold, but there's a law on the books. That's one in which, when that comes, we'll make a determination as to the best way we do it. So I go back to the principle that if they have the authority and they exercise the authority, you're in their jurisdiction, and you pretty much have to live under those rules. It doesn't matter whether you're based here or you're based somewhere else. When you have activities in a jurisdiction and they can enforce it against you, all the best defenses in the world are not the best way to try to protect the company.
Do you have a sense, and maybe it's too early, for some jurisdictions, a bigger or lesser appetite for extraterritoriality?
I would think both. I think there are examples where there is extension of extraterritoriality. We've seen that within the EU and the GPDR or what stands for the data protection rules, the general practices, whatever I will allow someone else to define the acronym. But certainly those have extraterritorial effects, both directly and indirectly, right? So whatever the lowest standard that is set and you have to do business, you have to make a decision as to, does that apply to everything because it's an easier system to fall under? That has an extraterritorial effect, even though it's not directly required.
Mm-hmm. Mark, what are you seeing out there?
Well, if you look back to a year ago at this conference, none of the following things had happened. The Brexit vote hadn't happened. The new administration in the US hadn't happened. The the re-election of the head of the Netherlands government hadn't happened against a populist uprising. Macron wasn't the French president. US hadn't left Paris Treaty. Merkel hadn't said we can no longer rely on the US. The French hadn't re-elected or had a parliament which was supported by Macron. And of course, we hadn't had the UK election last week. All of these are just massive changes, or they might be...
And I had hair.
All these are massive changes, and in a way, the trite thing to say, well, you've just got to be flexible in terms of your advice because all of these things could happen. But I think there's a danger in being too flexible and changing too fast and reacting too quickly to some of these things. I mean, the political cycle used to be 4 or 5 years, and we were used to a fairly stable relationship between the EU and the US, and there were things which were changing and things which were developing, particularly for digital media companies and tech companies, but it was happening gradually. And those things are still happening, but in the meantime, the political cycle seems to change from 4 or 5 years to a year or possibly even a week. At the moment, 6 minutes ago, the UK Prime Minister went into a meeting with her party, which she might come out of no longer being the Prime Minister by the end of this talk. Things happen so quickly. How can you possibly, as a external counsel or in-house counsel, advise sensibly on those? So I think the only thing you can really say is that the regulatory framework seems to take much longer to change. Yes, there may be sudden knee-jerk things which are populist. So Todd's example about people being fed up by the way tickets are sold, consumer rights, some of the employment issues around the gig economy, those sorts of things. Privacy obviously is a big issue, but I think a lot of those things are going to take a long time still to play through. There may be some sudden changes, but by and large, things are still going to play through. So I think it's still, the advice is keeping close to what's going on with the governments, trying to figure out where their touch points are and their hot buttons are in terms of regulatory changes. This is probably the time to, whether you want to spend more on lobbyists, certainly spending more money on the people who keep you close to what's going on, and actually look for the opportunities. But I think one piece of advice really is not to change too much too quickly, because it may all change again tomorrow.
Is there anything different about how you counsel your clients, though? In the sense that one of the things that's been a question mark that I see in Washington is that there's a sense that there's an electorate out there that may be detached. You know, it takes, you're right, a while to steer the ship of government in one direction or another. But if the electorate seems like it's going in a certain direction, at least in a public sense, even though not necessarily in a substantive sense, how do you talk your clients off the ledge when they read in the paper that people are protesting this or they want this, but you want to tell them that even if this happens, tax reform is not going to happen tomorrow, for example. You know, it's going to take a while. How do you talk to them about their nervousness?
Well, take Brexit as an example. There was a lot of heat and light immediately when the Brexit vote happened about, well, what should that mean about people's legal advice? What should that mean about the way they're structuring things? And the main things we've seen come out of that are really about adding flexibility where you can into big strategic partnerships. You don't know if the territory you're dealing with may change. You don't know if the parties you're going to deal with may be subject to new regimes. And so adding flexibility where you can, looking carefully at things like exchange rates and termination provisions, things like that, in a way you probably wouldn't have necessarily looked at them the same way before. But not necessarily, as I say, thinking, right, let's jump, we've got to do something about this now. Keeping your ear to the ground and I think keeping close to the locals. Ideally, Europe is one regime, but it's not like that at the moment. And it will become that again, I think, particularly the EU 27. I think it'll become easier again for tech companies. But at the moment, I think keeping close to people on the ground in all the member states is unfortunately necessary.
Well, Tony, Pinterest deals with also a lot of content, especially localized content. Are there specific issues that are bubbling up for you and that you're hearing about and that you think can be helpful in illustrating how some of these people out here might want to respond?
Yeah, and to tie the pieces together, a lot of the work with clients, I have several colleagues, lots in Europe, who pay very, very close attention to what's going on legislatively in the news, and I'm constantly getting pings at 4 a.m. about this thing happened, this decision happened, what are we going to do about it? And to Mark's point and to Todd's point too, a lot of time you need to wait and see how it develops and how it takes form. You can have a new piece of legislation that may or may not apply to certain platforms, including yours, and there's just a lot that has to happen before you know what's in play, what the consequences are. And with all this, all the acceleration we've talked about, sometimes the advice you need to give your client is the flip side of that old saying, which is, don't just do something, stand there, right? Mm-hmm. Wait for it to develop, wait for it to play out, wait to understand what's actually in motion and where it's going. And so, with respect to some content issues, I've been getting anxious pings, for instance, about legislation in Germany around hate speech and the consequences that's going to have for internet platforms, and how are we going to staff against that and things like that. And some of that really depends on how it plays out. And you've seen every few weeks a new issue will come to the fore. So hate speech. At one point, there's been a lot of concern about terrorist content, lots of concern about, you name it. And as you see these new legislation take form and take shape, by the time it's going to have a practical impact on your company, it may or may not look like the thing you thought it was when it first came out. And so a lot of it is to wait and see how other people are applying it. And also a lot of it, you have to remember, is going to be applied by regulators. And so their opinions about what it means and doesn't mean become really important. And a lot of times you can have really profitable conversations with them either ahead of time or along the way to get a better sense of what it really means to you in practical terms.
Viola, what I thought was interesting about our conversation is that we, especially in the U.S., see some of the macro things happening in Europe, but we actually don't look at the details. And so for example, when Britain decides that it's going to leave the EU and their country elections, that doesn't mean the EU is not doing things. There are other things that they're doing to carry on. And I was wondering if you could talk about some of that for a second, because I don't think that that's something that for a lot of American lawyers, is on our radar screen.
That's very interesting that you say that. Indeed, with all these big political things happening, many of my clients, especially US clients, ask me, so this is a crisis of the EU. So what's happening to the EU? Is the EU collapsing? Do we actually have to pay attention to what's happening, or is that all stuff that's going to vanish in the next 5 or so years? And, well, obviously not. The UK exiting the EU is a very tragic thing from our point of view, and I think from many Britain's point of view. But the European Commission especially, and the European Union in particular, is a very special animal. It's a huge administrative body. So for example, the digital strategy, digital single market strategy that they have devised, there are many things that, or many of the measures that they are planning to do that have just been proposed last year. And many people ask me, is this going to happen at all? Or are these things we can basically ignore because they're affecting especially technology businesses, especially businesses that practice in the digital era, and especially non-European businesses a lot. And what we need to say, yes, you have to take that seriously. It is going to happen because there may be Euroscepticism outside. The Commission is not skeptic. The Commission, that is an animal with a life on its own, and they just continue working, and maybe certain things are not as high up on their agenda as they used to be, but they're still on the agenda. So these things, they continue to work on, and they continue to affect people. And So there's a lot I can underline of what my the others on the panel said before, but one thing I think I have a slightly different point of view on, and that is the wait and see. I don't think people, especially also businesses in the US, should only wait and see. I think there are lots of possibilities, a lot of opportunities to actually influence the process. So with these digital, these measures to implement the digital single market, geo-blocking directive, for example, or also the EU copyright directive that affects certain platforms and host providers, all these measures, it is a very initial stage. So now is the time to discuss, now is the time to lobby, now is the time to actually put forward your point of view and your opinions. And if you think that as an American business, you won't be heard in Brussels anyway, there is a certain truth to this, but that doesn't mean you couldn't team up with European businesses who maybe have the same interest, and then through that gate, try and bring your view, your interests to the Commission's attention, which is something that very often can be very effective. And in many ways, I mean, if it's the only thing you can do, then that maybe should be one thing to be tried. So what I'm trying to say is, with all these measures, they will be affecting businesses who are actually located outside the EU, but do business in the EU. Some of them are good measures, some of them are helpful, because the European Union is a market, still a market, with, I always forget, 27 different countries.
28 at the moment.
Yes, well,
Today.
you're already withdrawing a little.
Plus Wales. Yeah.
And some are bigger and more important, some are smaller and less important, but it's different markets, different jurisdictions. So many of these measures are very helpful, and some of them, like, say, for example, the geo-blocking directive and certain bans on geo-blocking and differentiating treatments, are maybe not so helpful because there may be reasons why businesses are doing these. It's a very important stage, and these measures that are going to be enacted, and they will be enacted, it may take some time, but they will be enacted, they will be important, and they will be shaping the business.
You know, I just as an aside, I have to thank you, because I wasn't focusing on this question, okay? And then since you circulated some things to me, I've dug into it a little. And as a person who used to be a Treasury official, I understand how some of these directives were intended to sort of rationalize an internal market, but there seems to be an opportunity to actually talk about, to educate about what the effects would be on the external market, because what you do on the inside has external consequences. And so it was enlightening to me. But you raised another point, and I was wondering, for the people in our panel, do you sense also that that in the time of turmoil, that there are opportunities for intervention? That I know as a regulator, there are some communities, especially a technology community out here, who sometimes think that being involved in government, nothing good could ever come from that. But the truth is that sometimes governments actually are clamoring to hear something from you because they don't know exactly how something is going to work. Tony?
Yeah, so I would say a couple things about that. Number one, I think it's daunting, especially for a small company, to even just figure out what is in motion at any given time. I think just with the copyright directive, as of a couple weeks ago, there were literally 1,000 amendments being proposed. Just keeping track of that is daunting. But Viola's point about teamwork, I mean, that's the answer, is you don't have to do it all yourself. There are a community of interests out there who are very happy to work together on this stuff, and it's essential to tap into that and engage, whether you can afford to do it yourself or as part of a group like that. I do think that, one of the big things animating Europe right now is this concern that, in respect to certain technologies, there is a dominant U.S. player, and they're wondering, how do we set the stage for startups and new companies in Europe to challenge those folks, right? And so because they're thinking not just about that, but about that among other things, there's an opportunity there to educate them about what the foundations really look like for that kind of industry to take shape. And so, there are opportunities. For instance, I think one of the proposals in the copyright directive was some pretty intense monitoring that was going to be required by platforms. And I think, among other things, you have to keep in mind that if you impose those sorts of obligations on companies, that's going to by itself favor the big ones who have the resources to do that kind of thing. And if you're looking to start something up with 10 or 20 people, you might not be able to handle that burden. And for now, at least, that one's been taken off the table. And so, is there an opportunity to influence the process there? There is. It's difficult. It's complicated. It's even intimidating. But if you can find the right allies and the right people to work with, I think there is potential to do it, and I think it's also worth the effort.
I just actually echo both those comments, which I think there's a concern across Europe that US tech companies shouldn't come in and dominate. So, for example, the car industry, German car industry, huge importance to it. They're concerned that US tech companies are actually going to go further ahead with self-driving cars, things like that, and actually start dominating that. And so they're trying to put in place, as Sonia was saying, regulations which make the whole system work better, but those tend to favour the bigger incumbents because they can deal with the new regulations faster than the smaller ones can. I would certainly echo the point that it's worth getting involved in lobbying and what Riella was saying about that this is a good time to get involved in those sorts of nitty-gritty details, particularly with the UK leaving, because the UK has overall been quite a friend to the US tech industry. We're much more of a mind along your lines than necessarily some of the other big European jurisdictions are. So without the UK in the room, things are, I would have thought, going to be less friendly to the US tech industry. Mm-hmm. And so you do need to do more.
Just as a side point to this, and I mentioned to Viola, is that for all of you who are antitrust junkies, that this is a very delicate question because the European and U.S. views of competition over the past 10 years have become more and more consistent. But in this instance, when trying to create a climate for internal market, it raises the question of what's competitive and what's not competitive from the outside. So this is a question, and I'm just saying that there's not an answer yet, but these are important questions to raise. And right now, when the EU is thinking about these regulatory changes, it would be very helpful to have some insight from, because there's not, how people view competition and competition laws is not the most totally transparent. So understanding how the markets work here, especially for people who are involved in tech markets, may actually be very helpful. The one person that we didn't hear from on this subject was a person who's overseen government affairs for a while. Todd, what do you think about it? Is this an opportunity or is this time to duck?
So I think that the massive change that is real is this movement from large set-piece multilateral agreements where many of these issues would be on the table and we'd work for years and get to a point where we'd have a consensus built. I think of it in the TPP, I think of it in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, I think about it in the TTIP, and the fairly clearly is gone away. Right. So we're moving from a moment of, a long-term moment of many of the tech issues, at least, that were handled at least in forums that were multilateral. Mm-hmm. And the elimination of the multilateral piece in an even larger picture goes to a change from multilateralism to mercantilism. Mm-hmm. And not just isolationism, but regional blocks and fairly set regional blocks. So I think that the question that will be on the table for us as working in public policy and working on e-commerce going forward is, are the regional blocks going to be working amongst themselves? Like, will there actually be more of a movement towards an EU, East Asia, multilateral setting rather than a US-led multilateral setting like TPP and TTIP? And that we don't know yet. And without that, you become stuck in a place of you have to put your chips everywhere, you got to be working every day, you got to keep track of 1,000 different parts of the copyright directive, and then even more importantly, you got to keep track of, so what? It's great that they put it into place, right? TPP, all those years was spent putting it into place. Which parts are going to actually go through? Which countries are going to continue to follow some of the pieces that came out of it, and which parts are not? So unfortunately, I think for all of us, the fracturing of the multilateral system is going to have a long-term destabilizing impact. I do think it will benefit, as been said before, the largest multinationals, be it not just the U.S. gigantic multilaterals, but I also think about that in the sense of SoftBank and Alibaba from East Asia. And so there are different players that are now adding on the global scene and that will also be able to structure regulations to benefit themselves and then put the smaller guys at a disadvantage.
I am curious from how my colleagues on the other side of the Atlantic react to that. Because in the sense that while you're trying to pull things together in Europe, and the U.S. says, well, I want a series of bilateral agreements all over the world, this is one of those areas that fortunately nothing happens that fast, but it's a different approach and different outlook. Have you had a sense that the EU has reacted to that yet, or have a sense of what they think that means in terms of their future relationship with the United States, or possible, what I call the fracture of multilateral agreements?
Well, this...
No pressure.
No. Well, the thing is, this of course touches at one of the fundamental questions of the European Union. Right. I mean, the European Union it's not one state.
Right.
So it actually doesn't have any foreign policy. It does have foreign policy, obviously, but not really powers to conduct foreign policy. It does do that, of course, and it has people who concern themselves, but at the end of the day, that is still the realm of the member states. Mm-hmm. So and there are people in Brussels who think, or for whatever question you will be asking, you would find someone in Brussels who thinks that is a very important question and that the EU has to do something about it. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean that they're actually empowered to. Mm-hmm. So this really is much more something that the member states have to do and have to take the leadership in. Right now, maybe there are issues and problems that are higher up the agenda than this. Nevertheless, of course, individual jurisdictions within the EU have always had very strong trade relationships with different countries, not just with the United States, but also with countries in Asia, and are working on these relationships to even improve the conditions for trade. I mean, Germany, for example, is an exporting country. We live on export. So it is, it's essential for an economy like Germany that they have good trade relationships to the outer world, because otherwise we can't make the money to feed the people. And so these things are obviously happening. And while the US, and I don't think it was the EU's choice, nor was it the choice of the most important countries within the EU to change the negotiations to a bilateral system. I think that was more the choice of the United States or their president. It is just something that Europe has to live with, and to a certain degree can live with, because that is what they have been doing for many years. And another facade of this, of course, is that Europe is still very much concerned with creating this interior market within themselves. And that's still difficult enough. There are certain areas where that has been fairly accomplished, and there are other areas, and the digital area is one of them, where it hasn't. So that is something where a lot of energy on the level of the European Union and their Commission goes into.
Can I just
Go
come
ahead,
from
go
a
ahead.
slight, also European perspective, that from a UK point of view, with the idea of having lots of transactional, if you like, trade arrangements with individual countries, rather than having one with a bloc, was really at the heart of Brexit. That was one of the things people were being offered. And possibly that's something to be regarded with some terror, because someone has counted how many trade arrangements would need to be negotiated just for a country the size of the UK, and it's something like 900 just if we get out of the EU. And we're not allowed to negotiate any of those until we've left the EU, but we need them all immediately we have left the EU. So it's a bit of a conundrum. And so I kind of share the concerns that lots of mercantilist, I think the phrase was, trade arrangements is tricky, though out of that you may then form new trading arrangements. So the idea that China's now playing a bigger part is interesting. That's not to say that US shouldn't lead things, but that there's another player who is coming out with views on how some of these things should work and has quite a lot of heft is potentially interesting. The other thing I'd say is that when you go back to the beginning of e-commerce, there weren't really any international arrangements about any of this stuff, and it was really led by industry. So the approaches that were taken to all sorts of issues came out of the way that the leading companies were doing it, and everyone else did similar things like that to set the standard. And often those were ahead of where regulators may have put standards. I mean, I think something like privacy, a lot of that was led by the way companies wanted to do things, not simply because that's what the regulators say. And so, while I appreciate things are a lot more complex now and you don't necessarily want that, I think that it's not necessarily going to be terrible long-term if we have more arrangements with different people, because I think actually industry itself will work things out, and that will be the way regulators may then follow, hopefully. I'm looking optimistically at it.
Well, I'm thinking from that, though, for your clients right now, today, do they think that their world is uncertain? And does uncertainty work for them or against them? Don't all jump in at once.
I think sometimes there is opportunity in uncertainty. If one of the hallmarks of the move from large multilateral negotiations like TPP into smaller bilateral discussions. So one opportunity there is if you wanted to influence discussions around TPP, you need to be something approaching an 800-pound gorilla to have any voice or to have any ability to move that needle. If these discussions move into smaller forums, I hold out some optimism that smaller players might find more opportunities, whether alone or together, to move the needle in those discussions. And also, if instead of one multilateral approach that covers everybody, you have 7, 8, or 10 different ways you approach the problem through these bilateral discussions, it also opens up the opportunity to run some experiments and see what works. And a lot of times, people will be surprised, and if you identify a solution that exists in one bilateral arrangement, and it turns out it's much more successful in terms of its impact than the other approaches, then that one might be replicated and grow over time. And if you craft everything from the top down in those big multilateral discussions, I think you do lose out on that opportunity.
And I think I disagree. I think that the smaller players had much greater opportunity in the large multilateral pieces because they could focus and their voices could be amplified. That right now, because it's fractured, and because there are so many places in which there can be an impact that has substantive outcomes, that one of the advantages for smaller players was using a large multilateral platform because your voice could be amplified. So I think it cuts both ways, and I think that right now we've moved from a win-win multilateral approach to a zero-sum game. The US is up, Europe is down, or vice versa. So, and I think in the e-commerce piece, where I'd be the most nervous is I don't think we've even begun yet to determine what the actual impact will be of the elimination of Main Street and shopping malls, and the diminution of the community. The job numbers alone are staggering to a warehouse-based e-commerce world, and I don't think we have any idea yet about how different governments are going to react to that. So I think it's going to be a very much a huge change over the next 5 years without a multilateral approach to have much more power in closer to what e-commerce is like and has become in India, which is a very thin layer and then enormously deep power still residing in traders on the street.
It is very interesting. You raise, with the two viewpoints, it raises an interesting question in two ways. One is, does uncertainty work better for Boeing than it does for Twitter? And then does it work better for US companies rather than companies who traditionally tend to be a little bit more limber and a little faster than some other places in the world? And that's yet to be seen. What I see from the market side is not that much has changed, and in fact, markets tend to be sort of irrationally optimistic. So there's not been the kind of pressure to see how people are making tough decisions yet. It's interesting in that respect. Well, I think I want to get to questions, but I do want to tie up a couple of things first, because these people all want to know. What is your view of what's coming in data and security? It was a confusing area before. I don't know if it's any less confusing, but where do you think that there's some opportunities and some risks? And I'd be curious on everybody in the panel. I'm sure you have a view on this.
Well, data and security are two different things.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, if just briefly about data, which usually means data protection, of course, we have the GDPR looming out there. And it's always a bit, many of my clients, especially US clients, come to me and say, oh, there's the GDPR, and can you tell me what it means and what I have to do? It's not exactly as if there didn't exist data protection before.
Right.
It did exist to a very large degree, and the GDPR actually was meant to make things easier. Because now in Europe you don't have to deal with 27 or 28 different data protection regimes, you have one. That was the idea. Well, to many, of course, the GDPR, and especially the penalties under the GDPR, have made the subject of data protection for the first time a very apparent one. So many actually now deal with it for the first time now. So it seems a bit daunting. However, if you have lived with the different data protection regimes in Europe before, then firstly, depending on what jurisdiction you've been looking at, you don't find the differences that different. And secondly, you'll probably find it actually easier to now have one set of rules you have to comply with, basically. Of course, it never works out that way. You still have, I don't know, 10% or so that are different rules, but basically it is one set of rules you have to comply with, even if they do bring certain changes, especially when it comes, for example, we just spoke about extraterritoriality. That, of course, has been extended by the data protection regulation. If it has been extended to an alarming degree, I don't know. I don't think so, but of course, depending on your business model, you might think differently. Now, IT security, on the other hand, is something where maybe the European Union and certain countries within the European Union, and Germany being one of them, have gone a step ahead of where most territories are, in the sense that at least for certain businesses, they are imposing compulsory IT security obligations that have to be taken in order to protect the business against cybersecurity risks, which is something that traditionally was left to the free decision of the businesses whether they want to protect themselves or not. And now these obligations now apply to what we call essential infrastructures, so hospitals, traffic infrastructure, electricity, power plants, and that sort of thing. I think from a policy point of view, everybody would think that's reasonable step and something that makes absolute sense. Of course, when it comes down to detail, what measures have to be implemented, what are the costs of implementation, what is the risk of not implementing, what is the risk of not exactly knowing in the progress of technology whether you are actually implementing not only what is effective but also what is compliant. These are, on an individual basis, of course, questions that are very right to ask.
Tony and Todd, you have to deal with your companies and your product people, your engineering people, in light of where they see things are going now. Do they think, you look at that, what's been negotiated in GDPR and others, do they think that this is something they actually have to work on, or do they think all bets are off?
I'll start. Yeah, look, it definitely requires extra work. I think the bar has been set higher. I think in many ways that's a good thing. I think it's forced people to approach privacy as something that's more process-focused rather than just outcome-focused, and I think that's a great development. And you know, to Viola's point, it's not as if GDPR is night and day from the regime we dealt with before, and there are a lot of pieces of it that are quite helpful in terms of harmonizing the rules. There's still, as much as harmonization is a goal of the GDPR, there's still a tremendous amount of discretion left within the individual regulators, right? And so I think part of the trick is trying to predict how these pieces are going to be interpreted and applied by the regulators. And one interesting thing to me is the relationship between security and data privacy, they've always seemed really intertwined to me because, of course, the best way to ensure security is to minimize the data you hold in the first place, right? So I think you're going to see increased linkage between those two concepts as you have conversations with regulators. And I think insofar as there are gray areas about actual data practices and what you need to do under the GDPR, I think regulators' points of view about that could be influenced greatly by the nature of the data that your company holds. And so I would encourage people not to take a one-size-fits-all view on some of the substantive requirements, but to contextualize them to your particular business and the kind of data you're talking about.
Todd?
Yeah, can I echo that? Because I think that that's a huge part, which is that there's never a one-size-fits-all when it comes to data, and that and it matters to regulators also as to which data and why it's there. What are the crown jewels, and then which are the portions in which you actually want to share data, even though technically you may be in a position where you say, well, the rule says we can't share that data, and there are reasons that you actually want to. So I look at on the data security side, on the information security side, it works fairly better than I think we live in this world thinking like everything is vulnerable. And I'll give an example. What is the most sought after set of documents that exist right now that no one has actually been able to distribute to the public? Trump tax returns, right? There is incredible amount of desire and...
Well, I just happened...
And you're lucky enough to have Moselle has got them with him here.
I want the tapes.
Right, and the tapes, Soon enough, we'll know the truth about the tape. Right, the tax returns exist and they've not been disclosed. Right, and there is an enormous number of people, we believe, who are seeking to have those disclosed. So there are ways in which security actually can be maintained, that it is not an open and completely open world. And that's also healthy. And then you think about it on the other side, and I'll give an example, that there was a request for us to share data about some buyers who attended an event, and there was a cancellation, and the promoters wanted to reach out to our buyers and say we wanted to offer them tickets for the new event. And the privacy policy was like, wow, you can't actually do that. How would we do that? But common sense was, that's a benefit to somebody. They actually would like that, and if technically that was a violation of data protection, we'll take that risk and work with regulators on it. So I think that it's the scale matters and the context matters in data protection and information security. And I'll give one last example. We like sharing our data. We want to share our identities. It makes life a lot easier. If we are locked into that the only way you can ever have it and companies require you to be completely on your own, then it becomes a phenomenally more inefficient world. We like being able to tell our spouse or significant other, can you take my credit card and pay for that so that I'm not the person who wasn't able to be there at that moment. So we are sharing of data ourselves that technically is moving identity around. That means that we're not in a world also where it becomes it's only you and you alone.
I'm conscious of time, and I think we have about 10 minutes, and I want to be sure that we get to your questions. I thought this was very, just as an observation, this is something that we talked about on our call, that with all of this uncertainty and how we want to respond to them, one thing that I see from like 10,000 feet is, does this actually increase the barriers to entry for new entrants to a variety of fields who may want to interface with consumers or involved in cross-border businesses? It's something to consider. So, questions? And if you have any questions to start with, isn't it true that?
Rich Gray, General Counsel of Global Logic. Hi, Viola. Good to finally meet you. For our European guests, there's obviously been a lot of publicity about Brexit and about Le Pen losing, and now the new election in the UK. But as far as threats to the EU, what about Poland and Hungary?
Yeah, well, Poland and Hungary are interesting. Poland and Hungary, as I understand it, Macron is even suggesting there should be some kind of sanctions against in terms of their compliance with some of the European norms. I think that, to the point that Viola was making earlier about the EU actually strengthening, I think you will see that as the UK leaves, that the rest of the EU is going to pull together more, and they're going to have to include Poland and Hungary in that. I don't know how they're going to deal, particularly with Hungary, because I think that is a difficult one, but I think they're going to make a lot of efforts to try to bring them more into the tent, particularly with Russia, on the outside, causing disturbances in various places. I mean, Macedonia has just come through it, for example. There's a lot of scope for that, and I think the EU will be very keen to bring them inside, though I'm not sure it'll be Macron's sanctions that do it.
Other questions? Now, I have to warn you, this is an academic institution, and Bill Lemley told me that because of that, if you don't start asking questions, we can ask questions to you. I think it's to your advantage. These are great sources of information here you don't see very often. And actually, people are that they're not only talking about from what they see on a piece of paper, but what their gut instincts are. And I think that's very valuable information. So I want you to feel free to ask whatever tell us a little about what you're seeing out there that we're not seeing.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You guys, talking about data breaches, and data breaches is one of those things that there's big sanctions, or different sanctions in different places, but there's an awful lot of them. I don't know if either of your companies have had a data breach, but do you get the sense that actually the public is becoming somewhat inured to data breaches? Because they happen, we all lose our Yahoo identity or whatever, but then nothing much seems to happen bad to us, that people aren't necessarily as bothered by it as regulators seem to be.
So I've been a long time an employee of eBay, which owns StubHub, and we had a significant data breach in 2014, and reached out to the community as well as the regulators around the world, and we chose to require mandatory reset of passwords across the company, and the reality was, and there was never any misuse of any of the data that was breached, and there's still a question as to whether the requirement was more harmful than just informing, because we're not quite sure that people care that data breaches exist, and there is a certain level of people are immune to it by this point. I always reflect back, because there was a long line who said that we were always waiting in the data breach world for the Exxon Valdez. What would be the Exxon Valdez of data breaches? And it'd be hard to imagine that what happened to Yahoo wouldn't be that level of that. And internally, financially, it's had a massive impact, right? The consequences and the prices that had to be paid out and the hiddenness of it. But for the general public, I think they've become almost completely immune unless it hits their pocketbook directly.
It's interesting, too, though, because I think it all comes back to the type of data you hold and the type of data that's breached, right? In some ways, the financial end of things, it's happened so many times. It's almost like identity theft now, right? It used to be if your identity was stolen 20 years ago, it was unclear what you could do about it because it was so rare. Now, unfortunately, it's quite rare, and it's pretty. There's a set of steps that you can take and reliably fix the problem. And I think on some level, it's somewhat true for breaches that concern financial information. If, on the other hand, you're talking about something beyond that, then the fixes become less clear. And I wonder if the Valdez has more to do with who gets their hands on the data and what they want to do with it later.
Well, one of the challenges in that regard is that when you have data breaches, the consequences are not readily transparent, and they're not immediate, so that you don't know what you're not getting or what you didn't have or what the consequences might be. But it also raises a challenge for to be blunt, a degree of a lack of leadership on both sides of the Atlantic and throughout the world, that, and this is where data and security go hand in hand, including things like national security issues, is this. I don't think that our leaders have had a candid discussion with the public about what reasonable expectations for the use of their information is. And so, because I don't think the answer is 0 or 100. No one wants to be a hermit, but they do want to have an expectation that information they give to one place is used in the way they expect it. But I don't think that, I think that there's so many opportunities here to actually talk to the public about what happens and what the reasonable expectation is. So because of that, every time that there's a data breach, there's a surprise. And it's usually cast in the list of horribles instead of the practicals. I think that that's a challenge for all the businesses in this room to begin to talk about that as well, because they have the direct interface with the public. But that raises one more question. I see we have one here, but I just wanted to do this, though. Angela Merkel actually talked about Europe having to chart its own course. And we did touch a little bit on the idea of enforcement in a variety of European countries. Do you think that that talk will embolden them to increase their enforcement powers?
I was wondering whether I would get around a question about Angela Merkel. I didn't. Okay, so the question you're asking is whether an increase in enforcement.
Right, you're right. Americans always say that, we heard a little about earlier, that Europeans sometimes have rules, but they don't necessarily enforce them.
Yeah.
Okay? Some countries are doing much more than that, like Canil in France and others. But now when I hear Angela Merkel say that we have to be able to chart our own course, does that also carry over into not only having directives, but being able to enforce them in a little more effective way?
It's, well, the enforcement piece and the lack of, or not, I don't want to say lack of enforcement, but
the different approach.
The different approach, and that it often isn't as effective and as consequent as maybe the law setting in first place. That is something that's quite high up on the agenda within the EU, and there are, I mean, one of these proposals that I mentioned concerns the enforcement of consumer protection laws, et cetera, et cetera. It is a difficult thing with so many different countries, with each of them having different approaches, and then, of course, with many of the laws, especially on the European level, being vague to a certain degree and opening up quite a level of interpretation. Enforcement is a means of regulating, is a means of actually applying common sense, applying proportionality, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, data protection is a very good example. Data protection is a comparatively young body of law. It is not as developed as other bodies of law that we have. So it is absolutely necessary that we have an enforcement that is a clever enforcement, that is a judging enforcement, and doesn't just enforce the rules just because they are there, but applies other influences. So my personal answer would be there's not necessarily, it's not necessarily bad to have a careful and withdrawn enforcement.
Okay. There was a question here, but then I think we have to wind up soon.
Sorry, I didn't know if we would get time to get to it. My name is Jamie Crabtree, and I'm with Symantec. I want to just come back to and get your thoughts on a statement that was made, I think, by the fellow from Pinterest regarding identity theft and its easy-to-fix identified set of steps. I think there's some truth in that with regard to financial loss. And historically in the US, we defined harm related to data breach solely as financial losses, of course. But over time, as we start to see new and different types of breaches, we see new and different types of harms that are occurring. So for example, you look at something like the Ashley Madison breach, and we have suicides that actually occurred there because of that can be tied to people having had something very private outed about themselves. And now we start to see all these other things that are coming into play with regard to, you know, the DNC's emails being leaked, et cetera. What do you think the regulators internationally, US, EU, et cetera, what do you think their response to that is going to be? Because it seems to me like non-financial harms are much harder, even in the US, to address via private lawsuits.
Yeah, I think you did a better job of making my point than I did, because like that hits the nail right on the head, right? If your credit card number is compromised, you can cancel your credit card, and I mean it's an easy example, but it gets to the point when something deeply personal about you has been revealed against your will via a data breach. I mean that is never mind the Exxon Valdez, because it affects 1 million people. Even if it only affects one person, it's catastrophic. And I do think that as you see room for different interpretations of data privacy and security rules by regulators, I do think that that is going to be a big fault line on which they develop. You know, is this financial information that's at stake, or is the information something much more deeply personal that raises the stakes? And I personally think that would be a good point of focus for regulators to consider as they decide, you know, how to navigate different gray areas within different rules. But I think that gets at the stakes, I think, in the context about what kind of data you hold and what your responsibility is to your user.
Let me just say this, because I probably, unlike a lot of you, I have a lot of regulator friends. That's scary, isn't it? It's this, there is still an underpinning in a lot of this in consumer law. Those are very local. Each country has a different way of looking at it. How they define harm can be different. How they define the remedy can be different. There's been a lot of progress, especially over the past 10 years, in trying to draw equivalences between different regimes, but they're not there yet. That has been carried over to some extent into how people look at data privacy, but because data privacy is new, they can start afresh. So when you start talking about harms, there's financial harm, there's reputational harm, which to remedy in the UK is very different than in the US, and for that matter in Germany or in France. But what you're seeing now, because of the advent of technology and its accessibility all over the place, that there's a sense that there may need to be greater sense of uniformity and understanding of what's appropriate, not appropriate, and what the remedies are. So that's what I'm seeing out there. It's not there yet.
I have actually one last question for the panel, which is something that I think a lot of us are wondering, and I don't know if you can comment on it, but obviously a concern that a lot of people have is that with Brexit, for U.S. companies that have their European headquarters in the UK, should they be moving to some other place within the EU? And here in the United States, for people who are concerned about our new policies on trade and immigration, should companies be moving operations to places like Canada? And the question is, Mark's observation, of course, is that things, you hear dramatic news, but things should move slowly. And I guess I'd be interested to know whether you're seeing in your practices that people actually are making shifts, or there is more of a sense that things will sort themselves out and it's premature to start taking action.
Mark, should they fire their English lawyers?
Never. Well, the great new role which has arisen for us in lots of cases is Brexit Council, which is a great new thing where you kind of look across the whole business and you issue spot. And one of the things which you do see coming out of that is for certain types of businesses, they do need to have a presence in the EU 27. So, for example, content providers, TV companies, film companies, things like that, that need to fit within an EU quota of content, are having to look at whether they should move their HQ or move part of it to the Netherlands or Dublin or wherever. But on the other hand, you've got a lot of people who are employed in the UK, who've got families, and uprooting vast numbers of people is really quite problematic. So I think companies so far are doing the least possible. They're looking to see whether they need to because of any current regulatory regime. What's the least they can do? Do they move to Luxembourg or whatever? But so far, we haven't seen a lot of people doing it. I think partly because it's just difficult and partly because they're not quite sure what will happen yet. But I think people are certainly looking. There's, banks, for example, are taking space in Paris and Frankfurt and places like that. But at the moment, we don't anticipate a large move, but that could be being optimistic.
Yeah, basically where businesses are regulated, because not all, but many regulations, the financial regulation, for example, has a passporting system. So if you have a license in one country within the EU, you can offer financial services in all countries in the EU. But obviously, you need to have a license from one EU country. And many banks or financial services companies currently operate under a UK license, which obviously, once the UK has left the European Union, is not going to work anymore. So that is a sector, and the TV companies that Mark already mentioned. But the regulated sector, for them, it will probably be mandatory to at least have an office outside or within the EU and outside the UK. Whether that means they need to move their entire operations is probably another question, but if they don't, then of course they have business from outside the EU to inside the EU, which will become, we don't know yet to what extent, but it will become more difficult than it currently is.
On the other hand, since it got announced, Facebook and Apple, I think, have both invested in very large headquarters in London, and Google's put a lot of money as well. So I think, whatever shape of it in the future, there's still going to be a lot of people there doing important roles. So I think I wouldn't write us off quite yet.
Post-Brexit, I don't know of a single major company that's saying, let's go move to the UK now. Not one.
But I will say this, and there's something that we did not discuss today, but I want to be on people's radar screen, that as people, especially here in the U.S., talk more and more about taxes, that there has been an ongoing discussion getting louder and louder all around the world about revisiting how companies are being taxed and based on where they're located and where they do business. And it comes in ebbs and flows, but it's not going away. So you and your clients need to pay attention to this, because there may be some areas, as we start talking about revisiting regulatory structures, that they may want to revisit how they look at the global compact on taxes.